Good morning. Welcome to the Indy Boomer Show. I'm Mary Pat McKee. I publish a magazine called Indy Boomer. This is the May issue of Indy Boomer with Donald Davidson on the cover. I am sitting here this morning with Ann Poindexter. She is a managing partner at Campbell Kyle & Profit and has visited this show on several occasions and always had great information. Before we jump into it, Ann, though, I want to thank Jim Wofford Theater, Logan Street Signs and Banners for allowing us to have this show, and we're very appreciative of that. I also want to remind everybody that you can now pick up the Indy Boomer magazine in any CVS store in Marion and surrounding counties, any CVS store in those areas, and be sure and stop by and pick one up when you can. And you've got, she and I were talking before the show, got some great information for us today, talking about second marriages.
We were.
Yes. A lot of baby boomers are maybe having a second marriage. There are some stipulations I think a lot of people, I had no idea about, that they should know about second marriages. You want to enlighten us?
Sure. You know, everybody deserves to be happy, whether, you know, they're getting married for the first time at a later age,
sure,
whether they've lost a spouse because of death, you know, illness, whether they've been divorced, but particularly in the instance of death or divorce, a second marriage, when you have children from a prior relationship.
Which most of them would.
Yeah. When you have parents that are still alive, when you have a potential for an inheritance, there's some issues that really you need to consider. And I think that virtually everyone that is getting married for the second time needs to give serious consideration to having a premarital or antenuptial agreement. And let me stop right there and say, there's no difference. It's like saying facial tissue and Kleenex. It's the same terms, same terminology, vocabulary lesson. It's, you know, it's a premarital agreement, and that's what I'm going to call it. You know, as we get older and we approach second marriage and we have adult children who are thinking about their own inheritances or who are starting to feel paternalistic or maternalistic towards their parents.
Right.
Sometimes a premarital agreement can have a hugely beneficial effect on the family dynamics.
Okay.
If you're going to get remarried and your kids think that he's nothing but a gold digger, and they
must not be somebody marrying me.
Well, but if your children perceive that,
right,
and they are made aware that he has signed a premarital agreement and gladly waived his rights to your estate. He simply wants to marry you because he loves you.
Right.
Sometimes that can put those children or your parents, for example, at ease and help in those family dynamics.
That makes sense, yeah.
So that's one really beneficial effect. The other issue that people just are not aware of is when we marry someone, that spouse automatically, under Indiana law, gains certain rights in the event of our death, certain rights to inherit. And if you understand what those rights are, and if that's okay with you, fine.
Give me an example.
Great. Okay.
Give me an example.
So if you get married, your spouse, right off the bat, has the right to receive a spousal allowance from your estate. So as a priority from your estate, they receive a $25,000 spousal allowance.
Okay.
And then depending upon the circumstances, let's start, for example, if you die without a will.
Okay.
And depending upon whether you have children, and if this is a second spouse, they have the right to inherit anywhere between 25 to 50% of your estate under the law.
The second person you married
The
does.
second spouse.
Okay.
Yes,
okay.
They do, if
All
you
right.
don't have a will.
Okay.
If you have a will, and your will says nothing goes to my spouse,
And it all goes to the kids or something.
Your spouse can file an election against the will and still receive a share of your estate under the law.
Can a will state that nothing will go to the spouse? Can they still do that?
Your will can say, leave nothing to my dirty, rotten spouse.
But he can still come in. Excuse me, I'm saying
she can come in
the
and file an election against the will.
Wow.
And receive a share of your estate.
Okay.
And so, people don't commonly know that or commonly understand
or
that.
think about that. Yeah.
And so a premarital agreement is an agreement where you can sit down before you get married and talk to your spouse. When we die, what do we agree that each of us should receive?
Right.
Not what the law says, not what the kids decided. What do we agree is the appropriate amount for each of us to receive? And you can do something creative. Sometimes a home is very important to everyone. Sure. Sometimes it's the house that the kids grew up in, or the house that Dad bought with Mom, and now the second spouse is moving in.
Right.
You can have an agreement where if Dad dies first, the second spouse isn't just kicked out immediately, has either a defined period of time to stay there, but doesn't automatically get the house or get a large percentage of the house.
Okay.
Or you can even have an agreement where that second spouse can stay there for his or her lifetime under certain conditions.
True. Yeah.
But yet protect it for the children when that spouse dies. So you can, through that agreement, protect everyone to a large extent by defining what everybody gets and exactly when they get it.
Right. You've made me think of 3 questions, but we're going to have to take a short break and come right back. So everybody hold on tight. Real quick before we go, don't forget you can listen to us on the radio Monday through Friday on Hamilton County Radio at 6:30 p.m. We'll be back in just a couple of minutes. Thanks. Oh, I just figured out a lot of things. We are back. Indy Boomer Magazine. Mary Pat McKee here. So welcome to have you back. I'm sitting here with Ann Poindexter this morning. It's still this morning. I'm rushing the day already. We are talking about second marriages, what people should be thinking about when they go into second marriages. Anyway, in the first segment, Ann and I were talking a lot about these prenuptial agreements, how important they are to have in place. One thing we were talking about over our break was the fact that it's really important for really any second marriage to really give this a consideration and think about putting in place whether there's a lot of money involved or not, so people can make decisions intelligently, going into a very, marriage is a very serious situation.
I agree. And I would say, that's one of the most important issues is that it's all about the ability for two adults to make their own decisions and their own agreements.
Yes.
Whatever that agreement is, but their own agreement, not, what the legislature decided is the right deal, not what somebody else tells you ought to do, but what your own deal is.
Which includes the kids.
Which includes the kids, your parents, your neighbors, whoever else. Because the two adults that are getting married in later life, everybody's going to have different circumstances. You can have two adults both that have children from, a prior relationship or prior
Which
marriage.
I would think is very common.
It is very common. Yeah. And, when you have those circumstances, each party coming into that marriage will have some assets that they may feel an obligation to pass on to those children because those assets were accumulated during their prior relationship.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think, again, talking about two adults, these are things, you really probably shouldn't be getting married unless you have discussed some of these things. Let's put them on the table because, how many times, and I bet you see it more than I hear about, is terrible situations that happen when somebody passes away. Say one of the spouses got her, killed in a car wreck. That's not even an illness where you would have time to prepare. So.
One of the things that I hate to hear people say is they're not going to have a premarital agreement because you're just setting the marriage up for failure or assuming failure if you have a premarital agreement. First of all, premarital agreements can cover both the event of divorce and the event of death.
Right.
Or they can cover only one event. You can do a premarital agreement that exclusively says what the deal is when I die and is silent on divorce.
Okay.
I think they should cover both. I think particularly as we're older and it's a second marriage that we should be very practical and realistic. And if you talk to the lawyers who do divorce, if you talk to counselors and mental health folks, what's a huge factor in relationship failure? It's communication. And communication on finance is a huge issue. So talk about these things ahead of time.
Right.
And reach an agreement. And there's a relatively new, it's last year, but there's a new statutory provision that I think is very important and ties into this, which is that a guardian now can file for divorce for a ward. And so for a long time in second marriages, we've seen fights between children and second spouses. Who gets guardianship of mom or dad?
And that's obviously when they're incapacitated.
Right, when they become incapacitated,
sure.
absolutely.
Okay.
So now, if the children get guardianship, there's at least the possibility that the children can file for divorce.
Wow. I would like to see a case of that. Have you
and
seen
we haven't
it?
seen it yet.
Yeah,
I haven't seen it
Okay,
yet. There's no cases out there yet.
Right.
But that's a practical reality
Sure.
that is there now, that people need
Well,
to think about, talk about, and plan for.
Well, I think one thing that baby boomers have learned is that, when it comes to dealing with our parents, we want to be able to involve our parents in decision making for their future. If they go into retirement, whether they stay at home, there's all those big decisions, as you well know. And I think seeing that, it only makes sense that if you are going to get married again, don't leave your kids having to make decisions for you, or whatever the situation is. Get this done. And the other thing we talked about too was the will.
Yes.
Talk a little bit to that.
A premarital agreement in most instances defines at least the minimum rights and sets forth basic protections. As marriages go on, it doesn't prevent someone from having a will and giving a spouse greater rights. When we're in our 50s and we get married for a second time, and we've been married now for 20 years and we're 70,
right?
That's not a new spouse, and we may want to benefit that second spouse even more at age 70. And people have the ability to do that, even with a premarital agreement. They don't have the obligation necessarily, but they have the ability to do that.
Okay.
So wills are still needed. They need premarital agreements and wills, but people also have some additional flexibility to go ahead and do more as those marriages go on. And you can always amend a premarital agreement too,
I was just
under
gonna
certain
ask you that.
circumstances.
It can be
certain
amended.
circumstances.
Okay. Give me a quick for instance on what, say a financial situation changed, they won the lottery. Could you go in and adjust it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So just different scenarios would be the reason for that.
Yeah.
Give us another, other things that people should know about these prenuptial. I hate that word. It makes me think of gold diggers. It makes me think of the old days when they said, "Oh, don't get a prenuptial agreement."
Right. And I would suggest to you, and this sounds as if I'm being disrespectful, and I don't mean that, but we all need to think about it in a different way, and to think about it practically, to think about it in terms of taking control of a situation, making our own decisions, because I think we all tend to tighten up a little bit and have an emotional reaction to it. That's a distasteful concept,
Yes.
and it shouldn't be.
Right.
It just shouldn't be.
Right.
But here's another important issue, is that for, second marriages, when people are in their 50s and their early 60s and they're still working and they're still gaining retirement assets, when you get married and you have qualified retirement assets, under federal law, your spouse is your beneficiary automatically under a retirement asset.
Okay.
Now, again, if that's okay with you, wonderful. But if you're 63 and you have children from a prior relationship and it's not your intention and your spouse doesn't really expect to receive those retirement assets, then a premarital agreement is a good idea, and you can have a spouse waive a right to a portion or all of that retirement asset.
Okay. There is so much to know. I can tell you right now, if you are thinking about a second marriage, call Ann. Call an attorney. At least find out what options are and what different things you may need to know. It's better than coming out later and saying, "Oh, I didn't know that." Well, that doesn't work anymore. You need to find out about it. We have got to wrap this show up again. Ann, thank you so much for being on the show. Couple things real quick before we go. Don't forget, you can pick up Indy Boomer at any CVS store in Marion and the surrounding counties. Also, watch Boomer TV with Patty Spitler on Channel 8 on Sunday mornings at 10:30, and we will see you all back here next week. Thanks for watching.